Welcome to KCDC. I'm Casey Hunt. We are live every Sunday from Washington from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, executive disorder. The president puts his pen to paper, but this nation's immigration policy mess isn't going to be fixed overnight. Plus, I traveled to the border to talk exclusively with Senator Kamala Harris. I asked her whether it's time to abolish ICE, and she said we might need to start from scratch. And just in tonight, the Washington Post reports Stormy Daniels will meet with federal prosecutors tomorrow. But first, when we came on the air last week, the country was at an impasse. The president calling on Congress to act on sweeping immigration legislation to end the separation of immigrant families at the border with Mexico. The president insisting he couldn't fix it alone. Republicans in Congress were by and large horrified. And for the first time since the president's election, they said, President Trump, you've gone too far. And with every Senate Democrat also taking a stand against the policy, the president signed an executive order ending the policy he started the week saying he was helpless to stop. And now we are at the back at the start of that cruel circle. Families are still in flux. Federal officials are struggling to keep up to reunite those families. And Congress has no clear plan to reform an immigration system that has needed repair for decades. With all of this, I'd like to welcome into my panel here with me on set, politics reporter for the Daily Beast and MSNBC contributor Betsy Woodruff, Washington bureau chief for Vice News Shawna Thomas, and Republican strategist and principal at Cogent Strategies Kevin McLaughlin. And joining the conversation from Nashville, president historian, MSNBC contributor, and author of The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels, Jon Meacham. Jon, I'm going to come to you in a second for a little bit of conversation about exactly which angels are in charge right at the moment. But I want to start with you, Shawna Thomas, because, I mean, this week, I remember sitting here a week ago Sunday and wondering if this was going to be the kind of story that was actually going to break through, that wasn't just going to be another handful of minutes of news cycle. And, you know, those pictures galvanized the country. They galvanized both parties. And the president was forced to back down.
Yeah, and I think some of that is you still have people going down to the sites outside of El Paso and down in McAllen. You had members of Congress there yesterday. You were there, apparently. Briefly. Yes. And then also there was another event today that had basically activists, lawyers, immigration lawyers, that kind of thing. There are still people going down there. We had a correspondent there, Evan McMorris-Santoro, who was there with one of the people running for Congress in that district. Mm-hmm. So as long as people keep drawing attention to this, I think it is going to last for a while as an issue. The thing is, we're about to be on the 4th of July. We are going to be in the middle of summer. People are going to be taking vacations with their family. People are not going to be paying as much attention. I don't know if this issue goes all the way to the election. And that's some of why it's still bubbling up, is because both Democrats and Republicans think this is an issue that either needs to be taken care of so that it doesn't affect the election, right, or Democrats think they can possibly use it, which sounds callous, and I understand that, but it is kind of a situation we're in 2018.
Yeah, no, of course, we want to be sensitive, and the reality, though, is that there still are thousands of kids who are, we think, hundreds, at least 1,800 plus kids who are still separated from their families at this point. Jon Meacham, can you kind of put the week that was in perspective here for us? I mean, this has been an issue that we as a nation have grappled with time and time again, and we've had, you know, episodes where, you know, America has shown as the shining city on the hill, and times when we have not, quite frankly, lived up to what the Statue of Liberty promises.
Absolutely. One of the first debates we had in the country in the 1790s, and you know it's a good Sunday when you start with the 1790s, was a battle over the Alien and Sedition Acts, where we were an infant nation, and yet we gave the President of the United States the power to deport immigrants by fiat. Illegal aliens that he believed to be dangerous. Into the 19th century, where you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had viciously racist rhetoric from mainstream political figures in the 19th century who worried that, to quote a senator from Maine, I think it was, worried that there was going to be a yellow empire from California to the Rockies if we didn't limit immigration from Asia. There was the fears of the white working class that led to the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan from 1915 to about 1927 that was explicit anxiety that immigrants were going to work harder and possibly for less money. Now, conservatives who believe in a free market had some problems with intellectual consistency. Best never stop them into where we are now. And I think what's really interesting about the last 12 or 13 days or so is I believe it's the first time in the Trump administration where the president has explicitly reversed course, or at least begun to reverse course. I understand, before people start tweeting, I understand that this is like an arsonist. You were congratulating an arsonist for putting out a fire. But at least the fire was put out to some extent. And I think that the lesson for all of us in the country is that sustained public pressure, sustained resistance is absolutely essential at any moment in the life of the republic, but particularly one when we have a president who seems so determined to knock down the ordinary guardrails and the ordinary conventions of generosity that have marked our best eras.
Kevin McLaughlin, can you weigh in on what John Meacham is kind of putting out there here? I mean, you are, I don't know if you are a never Trumper. I don't know if I want to label you that in public.
I'm not.
But you are somebody who has been a member of the Republican Party for a long time and seen it change under President Trump. And quite frankly, it felt to me like the first time that Republicans said, no way, we're not doing this.
Well, and let me go back to 1790 polling data, and I'll take you through the times, just like John did. But no, I think that there was a visceral reaction to that because, I think Republicans have worked really hard to get themselves in a pretty good place for the midterm election for the first time in a long time, and they all see it going up in smoke right now. And, midterms are base elections, so I think in the Senate, actually, I don't think this is having a huge impact. I think it might kind of sort of help, if you will, on the Republican side, as long as it gets solved immediately. But on the House side, with so many swing districts and so many retirements in those districts, it's a real problem on the House side for Republicans.
For sure. And so speaking of polling, the reports over the last week said that President Trump wanted the showdown over immigration. My people love it, he said, according to the New York Times. We now have new polling from CBS News, and it shows the vast divide in how Americans are reacting and perceiving this issue. While 53% of Americans strongly oppose separating children from their parents who enter the country illegally, Americans are divided over whether reuniting them is a high priority. And the difference, surprise, surprise, is political party. 75% of Democrats said reunification should be a top priority, while just a quarter of Republicans said the same thing. And nearly 75% of Republicans said those who enter the U.S. illegally should be punished as an example of toughness, while 80% of Democrats said they should be treated well as an example of kindness. Here is the president this weekend in Las Vegas.
We have the toughest border you can have, considering the laws are the worst in the whole country. Our immigration laws are a laughingstock all over the world. We're the only people. People walk in, they put a foot in. Please, would you like to register? Other countries, they say, get the hell out of here.
And the president tweeting today in part, quote, "We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came." Kevin, I want to go back to you on this, and Betsy, I would like you to weigh in as well. But I mean, this clearly, the president views this as a base issue, immigration, and the polling to a certain extent bears that out. I think my question is the number of those Republicans shrinking as this presidency wears on?
And that might be true. I don't know. But the problem I have with it is that I think the base is pretty well locked down at this point. I think that, to be honest with you, too, like the stuff that Republicans would want to run on, the economy, ending regulation, judges, that's really good for the base as it is on the Republican side. And you don't have to lose people, per se, in droves with you do the hot button issue like immigration. So I think that's the big reason that Republicans just want to, in Congress, want to move on and get on to the next thing.
Yeah, speaking of political, the base of a party, this is the other side. But this week I traveled to the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego to talk with Senator Kamala Harris. During our conversation, I asked her about the growing calls from progressive activists to abolish ICE. Take a look. A lot of the signs at the rally you just held were people standing there saying, abolish ICE.
Yeah.
Is that a position that you agree with?
Listen, I think there's no question that we've got to critically re-examine ICE and its role and the way that it is being administered and the work it is doing. And we need to probably think about starting from scratch, because there's a lot that is wrong with the way that it's conducting itself, and we need to deal with that.
What do you think should be the alternative to ICE?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the government should be in the position of separating families, and that is clearly what is part of what's happening at ICE and DHS. You look at what's happening again in terms of how they're conducting their perspective on asylum seekers. That is a real problem, and is contrary to all of the spirit and the reason that we even have the asylum rules and laws in the first place. So their mission, I think, is very much in question and has to be re-examined.
What do you make of that? Is ICE the bigger problem here?
Well, I don't know how you abolish an agency without abolishing the function, and I think the function is necessary. As far as what Senator Harris said about examining what they're doing, how they're doing it, I think that's absolutely something we should do. That's our responsibility to provide oversight. But ultimately, there's going to have to be an agency. Before ICE, it was INS. There has to be some agency to administer the immigration laws in the country. There are a lot of questions to be answered. I don't know if I say abolish. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, but I do think looking at it makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Betsy Woodruff, this abolish ICE cry seems to be becoming a litmus test for Democrats.
That's right. I think particularly progressive activists are trying to make this a central, trying to expand the Overton window, if you will, the terms of the conversation that can be had about policy. That said, of course, these calls make people's heads blow up at DHS. And what you'll hear from DHS officials, from ICE officials, from the rank and file is that, look, it's their job to enforce the law. They are a law enforcement agency. And what they will say, especially pushing back against Kamala Harris, the senator from California, and Senator King, is very much that the problem is the laws themselves, not the law enforcement agency. That's the argument you're going to hear back. That's something you're going to hear from Republicans as well. So the challenge for progressives is to sort of differentiate between the way laws are enforced and the laws themselves. Of course, if there's one thing we know, it's that Congress is really bad at changing immigration laws. It's just been a non-starter for literally almost decades now, I think. And that's part of the reason that there's such a pushback against the agency enforcing the laws.
I also think that how the agency does their job is also governed by who is at the top. So the difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in the case of how ICE performs their function, whether it be within the country or on the border, is that this zero tolerance policy on the border is something that was from on high, right? So ICE has to send the people that they catch on the other side of the border into the judicial system. That's not the ICE agent's fault.
Right.
That is a higher calling.
Absolutely.
And as well as like the
And we've
raids
seen that
everyone
blow
wants
up.
to point to. And I think this is, if you can have a sign that says abolish ICE, then you can point towards those raids that are also doing things to families. But they are carrying out the policy of a president that has been hard on immigration since he ran for office.
And let's remember how much of this comes back to DOJ, rather even than immigration enforcement. The zero tolerance policy was a decision of the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. It was his idea.
It's really, at the end of the day, about the people who are in charge. Let's refocus, though, here for a second, because I do want to make sure that we keep the focus at where it needs to be, which is on these people who are still separated from their families, these mothers, fathers, and, of course, the children. I was down on the border because Senator Harris went to visit that detention center to meet with mothers who had been separated from their children. Here's a little bit more of our conversation. Senator, you've had a long career in law enforcement. I mean, can you compare what you saw in this facility to some of the other things you've seen?
I mean, it's a prison, Casey. It's a prison. I visited some of the worst prisons in the United States, and it is a prison. You walk in, there are 2 layers of barbed wire and fence. People are in pods, and there's kind of a more maximum security area and then the lower security area. The time I'm spending is to talk with mothers who have been ripped from their children and the pain, right? I mean, they're sitting with the United States Senator, so they kind of hold it together, and then we start to talk about it, and it's just the tears just start flowing, and it's awful. It's the pain of having to leave the only country they've known because it was so dangerous. It's the pain of traveling through an unknown land right through the country of Mexico, relying on strangers in these caravans, the pain of all that they will be exposed to during that trek, right, not really being in control of much, and the abuse that they may endure. And then they arrive, and without even having the ability to yet give their story about the circumstances of their arrival, their children are taken from them and taken to unknown places. It's outrageous and it's inhumane. And it's unnecessary. And I think, Casey, that's one of the most important aspects of this whole issue. It's not necessary. It's actually not necessary. But you know why they did it, and this can't be lost in this conversation. They told us why they did it. The administration told us why they did it. They did this to deter others from coming to the country. So you've decided to exact what could be a lifetime of trauma on over 2,000 children for a deterrence of other people? And, you know, it's unconscionable.
We're going to have my complete interview with Senator Harris up in the next hour. But John Meacham, I mean, with some of those kind of descriptions, vivid descriptions, I mean, and I sat, you know, I rode with Senator Harris to the detention facility. I was sitting outside there. I mean, there's rolls and rolls of barbed wire, those double prison doors. I mean, it feels like, it really feels like a prison. I'm curious, I mean, we have a couple, you know, dark moments in our nation's history that we all kind of remember. Is this one that you think is going to get added to that list?
It's certainly the most vivid manifestation of what so many people have feared about the Trump administration. And I think you go from the travel ban early on to this separation policy. And I do think also there's a difference between, it gets kind of fuzzed up in the conversation, there's a difference between a zero tolerance illegal border policy and a separate children from parents. And I think that one can be for a strong border and find what's happening with these children to be abhorrent. And I think that's an important distinction, and one that I believe, frankly, a more morally sound and a more intellectually consistent administration might actually make. Why wouldn't zero tolerance by itself be a sufficient deterrent? Again, that's a conversation that can be had, but the Trump administration isn't really interested in having a conversation. All right, this is, they are reaping what they've sown. Everything is a zero-sum game. Everything is the war of all against all. And so I do think this moment, partly because of the visual imagery, partly because the president was forced to at least partially reverse himself, I think this will be something that at least sticks in the mind longer than most of the Trump era, which is, unfortunately, there's so much of it, it's almost impossible psychologically to hold on to it. But we're called upon to hold on to it and hold on to it, hold fast to it, because we don't want to be the era that interned the Japanese. You want to be on the right side of history, and history is forever. These news cycles and Breitbart and Fox moments, even midterm elections, they come and go. But history is going to judge all of us, as Lincoln once said, down to the last generation, for where we stood in this era, where we had a president who really turned a us versus them rhetoric into reality.
And I think that that notion of history finally got to at least some of the people, at least that I talk to every day on Capitol Hill. We are just getting started here on KCDC. When we continue, we'll get into the culture war breaking out, from a fashion statement that the First Lady made to the press secretary being denied service at a restaurant. And in our next hour, we'll dig into the book Born Trump. Author Emily Jane Fox stops by. Plus, Ken Vogel has his latest reporting on initial coin offerings at the White House, which feature Mar-a-Lago. We're back after this.
A first look at images provided by the federal government of girls who have been separated from their parents.
Is where the details lie.
President Trump and Kim Jong-un making history.
Where the facts are buried. And the only way to uncover the whole story.
We have news just breaking tonight.
Is to dig deeper than anyone else.
Since more illegal immigrants are rushing the border, more kids are being separated from their parents. and temporarily housed in what are essentially summer camps.
I mean, look, I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. I read about did you say want to a 10-year-old with Down syndrome
what
being
I
taken
said
from
is
her
you can
mother?
pick anything you want, but the bottom line is very clear.
You?
When you
How
cross
absolutely
the border
dare you,
illegally,
sir?
These are not, like it or not, these aren't our kids. Show them compassion. But it's not like he's doing this to the people of Idaho or Texas. These are people from another country, and now people are saying that they're more important than people in our country who are paying taxes, who have needs as well.
Michael Hayden posted a picture of Auschwitz. Donnie Deutsch is talking.
That liberal Michael Hayden. Yeah, that screaming liberal Michael Hayden.
You're out of your cotton-picking mind.
Cotton-picking mind? Brother, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. I got some relatives who pick cotton.
Welcome back. The debate over immigration policy has gone far past policy and left basic decency behind on its way. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee is now facing backlash after tweeting out this picture with the caption, "Nancy Pelosi introduces her campaign committee for the take back of the House." And Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary and Mike Huckabee's daughter, was asked to leave a restaurant Friday night in Virginia because of where she works. Sanders tweeted, quote, "Last night I was told by the owner of Red Hen in Lexington, Virginia, to leave because I work for the president, and I politely left." That restaurant has since been inundated with positive and negative Yelp reviews. Meanwhile, White House policy advisor Stephen Miller was reportedly called a fascist earlier this week while dining at a Mexican restaurant here in Washington. Also, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen also jeered by demonstrators, there you hear them, while she ate out at, again, a Mexican restaurant. So I don't know who wants to take this to start. Shauna Thomas, how about we start with you?
There is a real conversation here about civility, right? And our ability to be in the same spaces at the same time with people who we do not agree with. And the Sarah Sanders example is one of those where was that the right way for the owner of that restaurant to handle the situation of Sarah Sanders eating in that restaurant? Well, it's definitely not going to further the conversation in between Republicans and Democrats for her to do that. However, the counter is, was Sarah Sanders using her White House account, her @press secretary Twitter account, to basically rally the anger against this restaurant in Virginia? Was that a proper use of her function and her title and her job as well? Neither of those things gets us any closer to being people who can actually talk about issues in the same room together. But it does really point to kind of where we are, which is it's an example of how divided we actually are. And it's scary that we're that divided.
I do think that one of the things that's frustrating is, you know, if we want to stop and we want to raise the civility, is people need to stop celebrating, like on the left, they need to stop celebrating people like Robert De Niro when he says what he said at the Tonys. They need to stop celebrating and cheering what people are doing in restaurants. It's outrageous, and it needs to be treated in the same way that people treat what President Trump says that people see as insightful. And so I think we need to have like a balance here somewhere. We need to find it. I don't know how, and someone's got to put a pin in the balloon. I mean, the balloon's about to burst, and it's kind of terrifying out there. It feels like a powder keg.
Right, well, if we're going to demand, you know, I mean, do unto others as you would have done unto you, and anyone on either side of the aisle who may or may not disagree. I mean, the idea would ideally be that we could, at the very least, in our personal treatment of each other, act that out. John Meacham, is this situation, this devolution of our civil discourse, I mean, are we destined to just kind of keep going farther and farther down the sewer as this goes on, or is it recoverable? Is civility gone forever?
No, nothing's ever gone forever. It's redeemable. The founders wanted us to seek a more perfect union, not a perfect one. I agree that it's hard to see exactly how this rights itself, but it can, it should, and I think it will. You know, everybody is in this Hobbesian moment of everything is weaponized. Now, you know, the Little Red Hen or whatever it was is weaponized. The Mexican restaurants are. But if you're on the left, you know, you're thinking, why isn't this appropriate? If I really believe that these people within the administration are ruining America, why can't I take a stand in the best way I know how? So I understand the reaction to it, and I think it's the Trump people. There's a reason they're where they are. They're very good at playing suddenly. Why can't we all get along after they have relentlessly and really created a culture of bullying at the very highest levels. If anything, this is a reminder that the presidency has an outsized effect on our manners and morals. And sometimes people say we're being sentimental about the presidency, we focus too much on it. But I promise, if Donald Trump had not conducted himself the way he has since he began running for president, even before when he was attacking President Obama and his alleged birth issue, which was not an issue, if Trump had not helped exacerbate the tribal tendencies, he wouldn't be his staff wouldn't be facing this kind of backlash. So you reap what you sow.
Far be it for me to disagree with John Meacham, but I don't think they're saying let's all get along. I think they're using this to drive the wedge even further and further, and they're saying they're doing it's all tongue in cheek. I don't think there's anything about this that they're saying, oh my gosh, just can't we all be nice to each other in restaurants?
The other piece of this is that it doesn't frighten the White House or Republicans to have these protesters show up. In fact, there's some evidence that part of the reason Donald Trump was able to turn the primaries significantly against Ted Cruz when he was because some of these protests against Trump happened, and Republican voters said, we want to support whoever is getting protested. So especially on the right, especially among the president's base, these kind of protests result in sort of a conservative backlash that the White House likely believes could be politically useful to them.
Yeah. When we return, Republicans in Congress are split over how to fix immigration policy. I'll speak to Congressman Rodney Davis, who has been critical of the White House's approach. And as we go to break, a study from Vox reveals that male political reporters retweet their male colleagues 3 times as much as their female colleagues. According to that study, out of the top 25 political reporters who those men retweet the most, just 3 are women. The Washington Post's Sung-Min Kim, a great reporter, is at number 11. Politico's Hadass Gold is number 20, and sneaking in at number 21, yours truly. Here's an opportunity for you to retweet women in journalism more. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at KCDC. You will also find handles for the wonderful women journalists who are on our show tonight. You should follow them also. Also, be sure to tweet us pictures of your pets using the hashtag DogsWatchingKCDC. KCDC's back after this. Welcome back to KCDC. I want to give you all a quick note on what might have been a life-saving moment. Spokesman for Senator Joe Manchin told me that Manchin aided his colleague, Claire McCaskill, on Thursday at the Democratic policy lunch when she began choking on a piece of food. McCaskill started waving her hands, signaling she couldn't breathe and needed help. Another senator nearby attempted to help her before Manchin stepped in, lifted McCaskill out of her seat, and performed the Heimlich maneuver. A local journalist in St. Louis reported that McCaskill has said she suffered cracked ribs. We have reached out to their office, haven't heard back yet, and no word on exactly what they were having for lunch, but we're very glad that Senator McCaskill is okay. Now, though, for something completely different, joining me on set is Republican Congressman from Illinois, Representative Rodney Davis. Congressman, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. I think you probably share our gratitude that Senator McCaskill is okay.
Absolutely, I do. Claire, I'm glad you're okay. And Senator Manchin, great job.
Right? But I do want to talk about the issue at hand, which is, of course, immigration and what exactly the House is going to do. It seems as though, and I'd like to know what your assessment is of where things stand, but the compromise negotiations seem to have fallen apart late last week. Now there does seem to be just some discussion of doing a separate standalone bill to address family separation. Is that the case, and would you support that?
Absolutely. I hope to co-sponsor it. But I hope we can actually get some movement on immigration reform. We've had a lot of people, our leadership team has sat down with all facets of our Republican conference because we're not getting any assistance from the Democratic side to address these issues that all of us have said, are bipartisan issues. Let's fix the dock issue. Let's secure a border. There are areas of this border that have got to have a physical structure, not just with illegal immigration, but with drugs that are coming into our country and ravaging the Midwest and areas that I serve. We also need to address the separation of families, and we have to address how we deal with our immigration system at hand right now.
What do you think is the likeliest outcome here? Do you think that the House will vote on a separate standalone to end family separation?
You know, I'm optimistic, Casey. You know me, and I'm always the eternal optimist. I certainly hope so. I know those individuals, leadership, and the folks that have been talking about a good compromise are sitting down again this weekend, and they're working hard to try and come up with that solution. The president, when he came in to see us last week and talk to our conference, he was clear that he supported both of the bills that we were supposed to put on the floor last week.
Then he tweeted, though, why bother? Don't bother doing any of this because, you know, we have to win more seats to actually get something done. I mean, did that effectively kill any chance for that compromise legislation that was supposed to be on the floor last week?
If it killed any chance of compromise, nobody would have been talking this weekend to try and find that compromise. That's why you've got folks like Jeff Denham, David Valadao, Carlos Curbelo, Mario Diaz-Balart. These are Republicans that represent districts where immigration reform is much higher on the priority list for their constituents than many other districts that Republicans serve in our conference. Sure. These are the ones that are sitting down with leadership. I got to give our team a lot of credit for being able to sit down without any Democrat assistance and try and put together a good compromise. And I'm hopeful that we can see that this week.
Do you think the Freedom Caucus, Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, other conservatives, are they negotiating in good faith? I've talked to a number of you colleagues who feel like they keep moving the goalposts, keep saying they'll support one thing and then changing their minds again and again.
Well, it's certainly very frustrating that we couldn't come up with a plan that really was the president's 4 pillars, border security, that actually funded a physical structure. It wasn't just authorization like most bills that we pass in Congress. Then we have to go back and vote again on the appropes. We lumped it all together. We also addressed the DACA population. 1.8 million DACA and Dreamer kids would have been taken care of and been granted legal status.
In exchange for the wall.
In exchange for the wall. Exactly what many of my Democratic colleagues who have been working with Republicans on immigration reform have asked for. But it's getting too close to the election. The Democrats aren't going to come together and help us govern on this issue because they know this issue divides Republicans. So I'm hopeful that our leadership team, who's done a great job in making this happen, and frankly, I think there are some that are negotiating this that are a little more worried about where they may fall in the next leadership election rather than work and making our current leadership team look bad, rather than actually coming up with a solution.
You're talking about Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy?
No, I'm talking about people who don't want anyone in the current leadership team to remain in leadership after this election.
I see.
I think there's a lot of ambition when it comes to negotiating legislation right now.
A very interesting undercurrent. Okay, I want to also ask you, as you know, Utah's primary election for the Senate is set for Tuesday. Former governor and presidential candidate Mitt Romney has an op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune today. It reads in part, quote, "I appreciate the argument made by those who believe we should stay silent, but I cannot subscribe to it. I know that any criticism may lessen the president's flexibility to enact policy with which I agree, but that end does not justify my silence in the face of things that matter." Do you think that Republicans need to show more courage in standing up to this president?
Well, there's the far right and the far left. No matter what we do, I'm never going to stand up enough for the president for the far right. And immediately when I agree to work with the president on issues like tax reform, immigration reform, the far left's going to say, why don't you just impeach him? We've got to get to the common sense voters that are independents and those that really make up middle America. You know, we've got to stop this politicizing everything like dinner. The fact that Sarah Sanders couldn't go to a restaurant because of who she works for and her political beliefs, that's not the majority of voters in this country. Donald Trump was elected, in my opinion, because of this move toward making everything politically correct in this country. And frankly, his campaign was the antithesis of political correctness, and he won. There are a lot of people that I serve in my district that voted because of what they see happening on the far right and the far left.
Do you think, I mean, this issue that we saw play out over the course of the last week, do you think it's a place where Republicans who couldn't stomach it actually stood up to the president? And do you think the president is right that his people love what they saw this week?
Well, I'm not going to be able to answer the second part. I didn't hear or read what he said on that issue. But I can tell you there are a lot of people in our Republican conference that have varying views on immigration reform.
But on the family separation,
on the family separation, that's a policy that's not unique to just this administration, as we saw today with Jay Johnson's comments. But this is an issue where Republicans and Democrats should come together, and I would hope that we can to pass a bill to ensure that we fix policies so that the Flores decision isn't going to be a permanent precedence.
And Congressman Davis, stay put. We're going to have you join our panel when we come back, and we're going to talk about your party's evolving relationship with the president and his relationship with your party.
You have an outstanding man in Dean Heller, and I know, and I've been on both sides of him, and I want to tell you, he's a tough cookie. He's a tough cookie, and we want him on our side.
Longtime conservative columnist for the Washington Post, George Will, surprised everyone this week with this headline: vote against the GOP this November. In it, he calls for Republican caucuses to be, quote, substantially reduced, says Speaker Ryan traded his soul for a tax cut, calls congressional Republicans, quote, the president's poodles, and criticizes Republican lawmakers for, quote, having no higher ambition than to placate the president. This after longtime Republican strategist Steve Schmidt tweeted this on Wednesday, quote, 29 years and 9 months ago, I registered to vote and became a member of the Republican Party, which was founded in 1854 to oppose slavery and stand for the dignity of human life. Today, I renounce my membership in the Republican Party. It is fully the party of Trump. In another tweet, he called the GOP a, quote, danger to our democracy and our values. John Meacham, put this in perspective for us. I mean, I have been reading George Will for, my entire working life, and he has always been, kind of viewed as a conservative touchstone, intellectual, a place where, you could go to, hear kind of the arguments that underpinned everything that then was played out across our governing system. And he is now not simply saying I'm leaving the GOP, he is saying vote for Democrats.
Yeah. George is essentially a Tory. He believes he's a Burkean conservative.
I never
he believes
thought of it that way, but
no, he is.
Very on point.
One of his best books was a book called, besides his baseball book, which is one of the great books ever, it was called Statecraft as Soulcraft. He's a Burkean. He believes that that government is not always the right answer, that in fact there are organic reasons to have checks and balances on the state. I haven't talked to him about this, but I think basically he would have the view, I don't want to pull him into this, my view is that the Trump takeover of the Republican Party is the first recorded case of a hijacker boarding a plane and the passenger sided with the hijacker. And the question is, has the Republican Party of Eisenhower, Reagan, both Bushes, McCain, Romney, is that a recoverable entity? And I think that's a very live question. Not sure what the answer is. We have a fascinating Senate race down here in Tennessee that's going to test this to some extent, and whether a deep red state will go with a Republican no matter what when there's a conservative Democrat on the ballot. But I think what George is saying is that the Republican Party that he knew as a young man at the Wall Street Journal and then becoming a syndicated columnist is no more.
Congressman Davis, can I get you to weigh in on that? Is this Republican Party the party of Trump? Do you recognize it? Is it the same party you started out in?
Absolutely, it's the same party. George Will, I like his baseball book too. I would hope that he would go out into Middle America and talk to some of the Trump voters. Talk to the former Democrat blue-collar voters who actually gave him the victories in Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other states. But George and Mr. Schmidt too, remember, they live out here in the D.C. bubble. Go talk to those voters who put President Trump in place. And his goal to make a Republican Party and a Republican House more of a governing house would actually be the antithesis of what he's asking for if he says go vote against Republicans, because most Republicans who could lose are the ones who want to govern.
If anything, it could make it work. I do take your point on that. Kevin McLaughlin, final word.
I think it perfectly illustrates the disconnect. I'm with the congressman that between the with Washington, D.C., New York conservatives and everyone else out there in flyover country. And I think it's a huge disconnect. It's a huge problem for Republican folks in D.C.
Congressman Rodney Davis, thank you so much for your time. John Meacham, thanks to you as well. We'll let you get back to your cigar. Coming up, a look at President Trump's habit of praising strongmen around the world, including one who is claiming victory in an election today. KCDC, back after this.
A fantastic guy, took control of Egypt, and he really took control of it.
It's great to be with the president of Egypt. We are very much behind President el-Sisi. We've had a great relationship. This has been very successful. I have a very good relationship with President Xi of China. He's, an incredible guy. They just, essentially president for life. Yeah. It's pretty good. I respect Putin. He's a strong leader, I can tell you that.
Do you like Vladimir Putin's comments about you?
Sure. When people call you brilliant, that's always good, especially when the person heads up Russia.
Putin's a killer. A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
Really, he's got a great personality. He's a, funny guy. He's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. He loves his people, not that I'm surprised by that. He's the head of a country, and I mean, he is the strong head. Mm-hmm. Don't let anyone think anything different. Right. He speaks and his people sit up at attention. I want my people to do the same. We have a good chemistry together. Kim Jong-un. We have a great chairman, Kim. We have a great chemistry. It's a great honor and privilege, because he's become a friend of mine, to introduce President Erdogan of Turkey. Frankly, he's getting very high marks.
Those were just some of President Trump's more overt displays of affection for strongmen. Among the leaders you heard him praise, Turkey's President Erdogan, who claimed victory today in a snap vote. Erdogan called for the election back in April, at a time when his public support was polling more favorably than it is now. But it appears the gamble paid off. According to state-run media, with 99% of the ballots counted, Erdogan claimed 53% of the vote, putting him on track to claim a narrow victory and avoid a second round of voting. Betsy, that was kind of a remarkable, I would say, display. And this is not how the president talks, of course, about his allies, America's traditional allies, Angela Merkel, others. I mean, he, was throwing barbs at Justin Trudeau. I mean, when you watch it all stacked up like that, it really makes me think, that's the kind of job he wants.
It kind of suggests that one thing we can say with a high degree of confidence about President Trump is that there is no evidence he cares about human rights. It's not something he's worried about. It's not something on his priority list. He has yet to go after any of these autocratic leaders. I mean, Turkey is the leading incarcerator of journalists in the world. It is an oppressive country. The president just isn't interested in these human rights questions. And what's perhaps even more significant here, though, is that in some ways he seems to take leads from some of these autocrats. For instance, he said privately that he thinks the United States drug enforcement needs to look more the way the drug enforcement looks in the Philippines, where Duterte is prosecuting an incredibly violent, lethal drug war where they kill people for just using drugs. So Trump sees some of these autocrats as people to emulate, and that's really unprecedented for an American president.
Certainly the way he approached Duterte was distinctly different from Barack Obama. We should point out the president did act in Syria when he saw the evidence of those human rights abuses. But Betsy Woodruff, thank you very much for being on tonight. Really appreciate it. Kevin McLaughlin, thank you as well. In our next hour, Ken Vogel has a show and tell presentation about the latest coins from the White House. But first, the KCDVR. Our staff of producers has been watching the World Cup all day, but managed to find some time to watch the Sunday shows also, so you don't have to. Don't go anywhere.